To complete a firing, I first load up the cart and bring that over next to the kiln to make loading easier. Then I put a post at the top corner of both of the shelves, and then I'll put one in the center on either side. You want to make sure that the posts are taller than all of the projects that you're putting onto that level. If you're doing a bisque firing, which means that your projects are still colored brown and they're very, very fragile, then that means that they can all touch each other on this level. So I typically try to load my kiln very full so that I can have to load it fewer times and get as many projects as I can fired at once. It's very important at this stage with a bisque firing to make sure that you're not hitting any of the other projects and that you're being super gentle in the way that you hold them because they are very breakable. Once your layer is full, you need to add the shelves that go above it. So you need to be extra careful as you're grabbing shelves to make sure that you don't get your hand cut on a piece of glaze that might still be stuck to it. And as you can see, you set it down so that it's touching 3 posts. And once you've set it down, you need to make sure it doesn't wiggle like it just did in the example right there. So we need to just very gently lift it off, just barely off of the posts, and then do our best to set it down so that it touches all 3 posts at the exact same time. And that's the way to help it be a little bit more stable, is to make sure that you're setting it down so that it touches all of the posts at the same time. So sometimes I'll just kind of hover above the posts and then just very slowly lower it down. As you're lowering the shelves down into the bottom of the kiln, you need to make sure that you don't accidentally hit the thermocouple or the little thermometer essentially that's sticking out from the wall of the kiln on the side where the electrical component is. So just make sure that as you lower, especially these bottom shelves, that you don't hit that with one of the shelves. Once you've securely placed your second layer of shelving, you're going to add on your next set of stilts. So you should have 6 of the same height, and if you don't have enough of the correct height, you can stack stilts on top of each other to make them a little bit taller. So for example, I stacked 2 of these stilts on top of each other to make sure that I had a tall enough section for some of the projects that I needed to load. So some of these projects were quite tall, which is why I did this middle shelf as just a taller space for them to be in without the shelves actually touching or resting on the projects. So as you can see, I just stacked these stilts to get the appropriate height and made sure that they were all the exact same height. When you're working on your second and third layers of shelving for your kiln, it's very important to consider weight distribution. So I like to begin when I'm working on my second and third level by starting in the center of my shelves, and I'll typically try to have something that's almost overlapping in the middle just to make sure that I don't have too much weight on one side of the shelf so that it ends up tipping. What we really want to avoid is having this second layer of shelving come crashing down. So as you're setting down all of the projects that go on these top levels, we need to be extra slow in the way that we set it down so that we're not accidentally rocking the shelf or throwing off the weight distribution too quickly so that it actually does fall on all of the projects underneath, which would be heartbreaking. So this is a very important part of this. You should also consider, as you're putting things in the kiln, whether or not they are too thick. So if they are thicker than your thumb, then they need to be hollowed out. And that's something that I check for on every project when I'm setting it into the kiln, is whether or not they've first hollowed it out if it's thicker than their thumb, and second, whether there is an air hole. So sometimes if they've hollowed something out and there's space and you can see underneath it, that means that it's hollow and has a way for the air to escape. But if it's thicker than your thumb and doesn't have an air hole, then I will not fire that project. So if there are what I call rejects from a load that you're doing, I'll put it back on the green shelf and just try to find that student and have them hopefully try to create another hole in their project so that it can be fired. However, that is a pretty difficult task. So that's just something that I check for as I'm loading things into the kiln. On these second and third layers, it's okay if something is hanging off the side of the shelf and is not quite supported, just as long as it's not like falling down into that space. You also want to be very careful that you don't have any projects that are touching any of the springs. And I do have some, or the coils that are sticking out, and I do have some that are beginning to kind of come, like pop out of their spaces a little bit. So if something is touching one of those coils when they are at their full temperature, then it will make that section of the coil die. So we want to be extra careful that we don't have any projects that are hanging off the edge or like leaning up against the wall and actually touching one of those sections. And here is that slow process of lowering a shelf for you to see again. And remember that it is a very slow process to make sure that we keep these as sturdy as possible, especially when you start to reach this third level, things start to get pretty rocky. So it's very, very important that you're aware of how slowly you're putting it down and that you're trying to touch all 3 posts at the same time. Something that can help you with that is making sure that your hands are not in the way of any of those 3 posts. So holding it at an angle or in spots where your hands don't have to readjust or move to make space for the posts is the most beneficial way to put them down. You should also notice that on this shelf example, you can see some glaze sections that have been left behind on the Kiln Wash. And it's really important that you make sure that when you are using shelves that have that on it, that you do not touch those spaces because they are incredibly sharp and can cut you. To help with the weight distribution, especially on a third level shelf like this, I made sure to put the thing right in the center. And as you can see, I was holding it by that thin wall and it just broke. And sometimes that happens. I put that in here so that you won't feel bad if something does happen to break when you are setting something down. Just so that's just another reason to be very, very aware of how fragile these pieces are. So again, I'm putting everything in the center first. It's perfectly fine if they're touching or even resting on top of each other in certain cases. And I'm just making sure that as I fill this top level, that none of my pieces are going to be touching the top of the kiln. So I need to make sure that they are beneath that top level surface where the lid is going to close. Now, once again, this is how you load a kiln for a bisque firing, which means that all of these pieces are still bone dry, they're very fragile, and they're sort of brown. It's very different for a glaze firing because those pieces should be at least 1 inch away from each other. To set this to run for a bisque firing, you first need to double check that you don't have anything that's like above the surface level or that would be touching the surface level. And then we're going to program the kiln just on the side here. So I always begin by just pressing stop to make sure that it's completely clear and that it says idle, and it should say the degree that it is. Currently it'll say like that degree, and it'll pretty much be what degree it is in the room. So what we're going to do next is press cone fire. We don't ever really need to do a preheat. It's just going to say 0, 0. So we're going to say okay or enter. Now for this, we want it to say the correct cone for a bisque firing. So cone 5 is what you would do for a glaze firing, but since we're doing the very first firing and the clay is still brown, we're going to say cone 0, 4. So that's the cone that we're firing to because it's a bisque firing. Next, we're going to say enter, and it says fast. That's what we would do for a glaze firing, but for a bisque firing, we want it to be slow. And that allows it to help that water try to escape if there were any projects that weren't completely dry. So once it says slow, we're going to say enter. it says hold, and we never really need to do holds. I don't ever do that, so I just say enter again. And then once it says idle, that means that all of your programming is done, and now we just need to begin the process. So I'm going to make sure that the lid is closed and then latched so that it's locked, that the fan is on, and then I'm going to press start. So when I press start, it says on, and then it'll start making a clicking noise that you can hear. And that means it's ready to go. There aren't many differences for doing a bisque firing versus doing a glaze firing, but I'm going to show you just what those specific differences are. So we still start by pressing stop. I like to just see that it says idle, and then it says 79, which is typically the temperature that it shows just in the classroom there. So once it says the temperature, I'll come down to where it says cone fire, and I'll press that. So it says preheat, which we don't ever do a preheat for, so I'm just gonna press enter. And then right now it says cone 04, and that means that it's for a bisque firing. So if we're doing a glaze firing, it needs to reach a much higher temperature. So instead, I'm going to just press 5. So it'll be cone 5, no 0, and that's really important. So we're gonna press just 5, and then we're going to press enter. And the speed can also be fast because we don't have to try to get the air to slowly release from a project if it's not all the way dry. Since they've done a bisque firing already, it should just be able to fire fast. So we're gonna press enter. We never do holds, so we're just going to press enter again. And now it says idle. So what we can do next is just press start, and that will make a little clicking sound and it will be turned on. You want to make sure that the lid is on tight, and that when you have the lid on, that you lift this little latch up to click onto it. So if you look up here, you can see this is what's holding it up. So it's on this little notch right here. So if you lift up on that lid and let the latch go, it'll come down. So let me show you what that looks like. So all I did was lift that latch up before I lifted it so that it would be able to lift down. And then we just need to slide this so that it can clip on. It doesn't always clip on exactly right, so you just kind of have to scooch it. And now that's closed all the way. Something else that you should know about a glaze firing is that when you do a glaze firing, the shelves that you use have to have what's called Kiln Wash on them. So that's this like white colored paint that you see, and you'll typically notice like little pieces of glaze that are broken on it because Kiln Wash does a really great job of releasing projects rather than letting it get fused to the shelf forever. So an example of a shelf that does not have Kiln Wash is this one right here. So you can see it's sort of yellow, and even on this edge here you can see the difference between one that has Kiln Wash on it and one that does not. Now if we have too many shelves that are either not covered in Kiln Wash or covered in a bunch of little specks like this, we don't want to set projects on top of those specks because that will fuse it to the shelf as well. So what you can do is ask a TA to use the box of Kiln Wash that's in the glaze room. They can just mix it with a little bit of water and then paint over this entire shelf so that we have a new layer of Kiln Wash on top of this, and things won't get stuck or fused to the actual shelf itself. So we have to make sure that we have Kiln Wash. Something else that you have to consider as you're doing a glaze firing is that pieces need to be about an inch away from each other. So you can see, like for example, this mug was about an inch away from this mug, which was about like a half inch or an inch away from this mug. So you can sort of see in the pattern from previously fired projects that they cannot be directly next to each other. They have to have space, or else if glaze runs off of the project, so if this mug were too close and a bit of it like ran off, then it might actually contact this mug and get stuck to it. So as you're loading the kiln, you need to make sure that the projects are not too close together when you're doing a glaze firing.